Alright, greetings everybody, and welcome to my history lecture series. This, as you can probably tell, is part of a series dealing with Canadian history, and I'll probably be adding Canadian history lectures out of sequence because I'm posting them, the initial ones I'm posting that meet the demands of the courses I'm teaching at the time, which are now online due to COVID-19. But at some point I'll be going back and putting in everything from the beginning. I start right back from European colonization, the 1400s, and take you right up to the end of the 20th century. So this one, of course, is dealing with Canada in the 1920s, and much like many other economies at the end of the Great War, there was a tremendous amount of relief that the war was over. There was a tremendous desire to get back to a level of normalcy again, although it was probably a lot harder for Europeans to get back to normal, particularly the French, where their landscape had been completely, so many millions of acres had been devastated by the war and rendered completely unusable for agricultural purposes for years to come. Certainly Great Britain had a little bit of distance, so when those troops went home, they went home with the mental scars, with the PTSD, shell shock as they called it back then, but there was no evidence of war on the streets of London. Certainly in the United States and Canada, that was even more pronounced. So when those troops come back, there was a real sense that we have just been through the most horrific experience of our lives, and now we want to get back to living our lives in Canada and retrieving some semblance of normalcy, although that would be that as we know is very, very difficult. When I think of the World War I generation, my heart goes out to them, and because I know that there was nothing in place in terms of mental health to help these people. And you just had to suck it up and move forward. I mean, in fact, during the war, a lot of generals thought that shell shock was just men being weak and they needed to toughen up. There wasn't the understanding that this was mental, and it was also physiological. Their body was being destroyed physically by the impact of the war, as well as their mental health. So a remarkable generation that came back and just wanted to get back to work. So fortunately for that generation, they were about to experience one of the most remarkable economic booms in Canadian history, and of course the conditions were very similar in the United States and also other Western democracies at the time. So all right, well, after years of worker sacrifices during the war, a new era of activism commenced. So a couple things we need to consider. If you've watched my lectures on Canada during World War I, you might recall that the working classes made a tremendous amount of compromises because the Canadian government would tell them, look, we know you've got demands for wages and better conditions and so forth, but let's win this war, see it through, and when this thing is done, we can get to the table and begin to talk. So I think there was kind of an expectation amongst working families and working people that there would be a renewed sort of respect and appreciation certainly for all their efforts during the Great War. So that was creating pressure. The other piece that was creating pressure was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Now, strictly from the perspective of serving as an inspiration, that was creating a lot of problems, because now people are beginning to ask questions. Hey, what's going on in Russia? What is Bolshevism? What is Marxism? What does that mean? And naturally, when people began to read about what Marxism means on paper, because of course how it was applied are two completely different things from how it was written out, according to Marx and later Lenin, it was creating a lot of tensions in Western democracies because people were beginning to be pulled in that direction. The rise in unions and worker solidarity led to strikes across Canada. So a lot of the strikes occurred directly after the war because the workers felt that they were not being treated properly and that the government was trying to renege on certain promises made during the Great War. Socialist ideas spread in the West, and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 influenced many radicals to adopt communism as a future ideal. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising that people are drawn to the language of communism because on paper, once again, the theoretical part is all about, the equal distribution of wealth, sharing, socialized education, medicine. Yes, the revolutionary part is violent, but the end game is to create a free and equal society. Very utopian. But yet has a tremendous amount of appeal amongst working people at the time. In 1919, union leaders in the West succeeded in founding one big union, which would represent all workers in one organization. Wow. Now this has got a lot of potential to be a problem. Let me explain. If bakers, blacksmiths, shoemakers, farmers, are all part of the same union. In principle, it sounds good because they're all working together. The problem is, if the shoemakers decide to go on strike, then the blacksmiths, the farmers, and everybody else has to go along with them too, right? So, the only problem with a one big union concept is that reason there. Although, certainly when it comes to a position of making demands, they are likely to be more quickly met when you have the threat of one big union, which essentially could shut down the city. I mean, you're talking, railway workers, you're talking electric car, tram workers, municipal workers, policemen, so on and so on and so on. So, it was a pretty daunting thing when you had one big union. In Winnipeg, there was a general strike, and this was no small brush fire strike. This was a major, major strike. 30,000 people went on strike and basically paralyzed the city. Nothing was moving, nothing was happening. Business leaders and politicians formed the Citizens Committee of 1,000. They saw the strike as a communist conspiracy to overthrow the government. Now, you have to consider, in 1919, the Russian government was still in the middle of a very, very intensive civil war. People were now aware of what this revolution basically represented. The existence of a new communist state would embolden communist parties and radical Marxists all over the world because now they had their big inspiration. So it's understandable why business leaders would see this, because were there Bolshevik sympathizers in the Winnipeg General Strike? Of course there were. Were the majority of them Bolshevik? Highly unlikely. Most of them maybe weren't even paying attention to the events overseas. Most people were just concerned about how to get food on the table and how to make enough money to pay the bills. So, but the moment you cry communism, that can become a really powerful scapegoat to strong-arm situations. And that is what becomes the hallmark of anti-communism all through the 20th century, that you cry communism and you've given yourself the right to suspend civil liberties, to destroy democratic socialist governments, to do all kinds of things. I mean, the Cold War gets wrapped up in this whole notion, but the idea that the Winnipeg General Strike was being guided and directed by Bolsheviks is a little bit strong, but that was the thought there. The government, the Manitoba government, intervened on the side of business, and the city hired police and brought in the Northwest Mounted Police to break it up. Foreign-born labor leaders were deported. So, the tendency in the early struggles of working class parties always had to contend with the idea that they weren't just fighting their employers, they were fighting government. Because if the government had to throw throw themselves in with one lot, it's going to be with the business owners over the workers. It's not so much that government was anti-worker, but once this fear and phobia of socialism and communism becomes a really powerful thing in the Red Scare, and certainly in 1919 there was a significant Red Scare in the United States beyond certainly Winnipeg, you know, you've given government a reasoned judgment to intervene on the side of business. The interesting irony of this is that people who were part of the leadership of the Winnipeg General Strike, who were foreign born, were deported because they said they're the ones that are importing this communist menace, particularly those from Eastern Europe. The reality was that people who were fleeing the revolution or fleeing Tsarist Russia before the revolution can't imagine that they would be particularly interested in going back there, particularly that they were doing quite well in Canada. But, you know, there was that fear that maybe somehow they were importing these ideas into Canada. So, while the strike was a failure, some like J.D. Wordsworth would form the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which would later become the New Democratic Party. So out of this was the voice of reason. You have the hasty, reactive attitudes of business and government. You have the radical language of the Bolsheviks and the communist sympathizers. And then you have the CCF, who become the middle ground, because Wordsworth understood that the working people in Winnipeg and across this country had legitimate issues where wages were concerned, where working conditions were concerned, and he wanted to create a democratic party that could claim to serve the interests of working and low-income families. So it was kind of a compromise between those two elements. All right, well, after the war, regionalism became a growing concern in Canadian politics. Now, what is regionalism? I don't know if this term is used in the United States, and I don't know if regionalism was quite as pervasive. I mean, I suppose you could look at the American Civil War was a war built upon the ideas of partially on regionalism. But basically, regionalism is the idea that certain parts of the country feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. So in other words, if you look at it from the perspective of British Columbia, they might be thinking that policymakers and decision makers in Ottawa are not in the least bit concerned about what goes on out in BC, and that they're going to put Ontario first. And now you begin to have political parties crop up that claim to represent the interests of certain regions, whether it be prairie farmers or British Columbia, lumber and fishery industries and so on and so forth. So regionalism becomes a little contentious in the 20s. And of course, regionalism persists to this day as well. Maritimes suffered as oil became a power source. They were rich in coal, so their economy had to change. Anytime, there's a resource that is overtaken by something else, in this case, oil by coal, when you have an economy built around coal, that is going to create all kinds of problems. Prairie farmers protested protectionism of the national policy. That would be John A. Macdonald's national policy, as they had to buy more expensive Canadian machinery. Agricultural products were sold on the open world market. Okay, protectionism. Boy, loaded question. I need to just quickly explain this because I think it's really important to understand. During the 1890s, prairie farmers in Canada who had access to American-made machinery found that American-made machinery, this is farming equipment I should say, was better made and less expensive. Okay? So if Canadian farmers are buying American-made farming equipment and then Canadian businesses who make Canadian farm equipment are not selling their product, Canadian businesses want to protect their industry. So protectionism is the idea that you put on import taxes on American-made goods so that Canadian goods are cheaper on the Canadian market. Now let me give you an example. Let's use a tractor. Canadian tractor is 20 bucks, and this is just a figure. American tractors are better, and they're only $18. Which one is the prairie farmer going to buy? He's going to buy the $18 American-made tractor because it's better and it's cheaper. This is what protectionism is. You put a $7 tax on every American-made tractor, so that $18 tractor on the market becomes $25, and the Canadian tractor becomes $20. Inevitably, you might still buy the American tractor, but depending on how you are financially, you might feel forced to buy American-made stuff. Now, protectionism protects local industries and protects business interests, but consumers always get the short end of the stick because we end up paying more for things because our local industries are being protected, and therefore it's going to cost us more to get imported goods. That's why prairie farmers protested protectionism. Farming communities supported parties who sought free trade, like the Progressive Party. Okay, free trade, the reduction or elimination of cross-border taxes, so then, therefore, hey, if I want to go down to Minnesota or North Dakota and buy a American-made tractor, I can do that without having to worry about import duties. Of course, that is going to hurt Canadian-made tractor business. But, you know, from the perspective of the farmer, is, well, then Canadian tractor-making companies need to make them better, and they need to reduce their price. Because that's what capitalism's all about, right? Competition. In the 1921 election, there were two new leaders in addition to a new party. William Lyon Mackenzie King, who led the Liberals, and Arthur Meehan, who replaced Robert Borden for the Conservatives. So, of course, William Lyon Mackenzie King would cast a very long shadow on Canadian politics. He would lead the country on and off between these years in 1948 for quite a significant amount of time. While the Progressive Party did not last, it was influential in changes to Canadian social policy. They were able to pressure King to establish the Old Age Pension Act in 1927, which provided $240 per year to seniors. So this is even before the Great Depression. So, you know, this is where the activism of a left-wing party, you know, democratically left-wing, we'd have to say the CCF were, that the pressure of that party and the pressure that its constituents were putting on Canadian social policy forces the Canadian government to start implementing a social safety net. And of course that becomes more and more pronounced after the end of the Second World War, but it begins here in the 1920s. Alright, so Canada's growing independence. So after the war, Canada sought greater independence from Britain, like refusing to support Britain in action against Turkey, or signing a treaty without requiring Britain's signature. So basically, at the end of World War I, we had achieved a great level of respect from Western democracies at the Paris Peace Conferences. Robert Borden represented Canada very well. Our contributions in World War I were very, very significant for a country our size, with a significantly smaller population than other European nations. And I think that there was this sort of sense after World War I where it was like, hey, you know what? We don't need our, Great Britain to take care of us anymore. You don't need to micromanage us anymore. We're capable of making our own decisions. We don't have to blindly follow you into every conflict around the world just simply because we're loyal to the empire. If you guys do something that we don't agree with, that is Great Britain, then Canada should be allowed to say we don't want to be part of that. If we want to sign a treaty that has nothing to do with Britain, we shouldn't have to wait for Great Britain to give us approval. So there's a bit of a shift in the 20s towards a greater autonomy. In 1925, the Governor-General, Viscount Byng, refused King's request for an election, but King would prevail by suggestion that it was undemocratic for an official appointed by Britain to refuse advice from the Prime Minister who was elected by Canadians. Okay, so why would an appointee of Great Britain be in a position to prevent an election from occurring? For whatever reason, right? So the King-Byng crisis, it's called, the King-Byng crisis of 1925, is a shift where Canada would get sort of the upper hand in saying, if we as an independent Dominion want to have an election, we do not need the approval of Great Britain. So, in 1926, the Balfour Report, Britain acknowledged the need for greater autonomy of dominions, and in 1931, the Statute of Westminster was passed by the British government. The Empire became the Commonwealth, right, making Canada equal in status to Britain and entitled to make its own laws. I believe that South Africa got the same benefits in the Statute of Westminster, and I believe New Zealand and Australia as well. We are still connected with Great Britain through the Crown, through our history. We're part of a broader community of nations in the Commonwealth. However, we are independent and free to make our own decisions and choices. However, the British North America Act remained because federal and provincial leaders could not agree on an amending formula, which is a procedure of changing the Act. So the British North America Act was written in 1866-67 and became our first constitution when we became a Dominion and Canada was born as a nation. But when it came to a time where we could begin to make alterations to this Constitution or this British North America Act, the provinces couldn't really come to a consensus as to how to do this, because everybody was concerned that they're going to want to adjust the Constitution based on regional biases and interests. So everyone's going to kind of work out of self-interest. So they couldn't figure out an amending formula, which is a procedure of changing the British North America Act. Demand for wheat, pulp and paper and minerals, much of which fueled international consumerism, helped the economy expand in 1920s. Okay, Canada was an enormous wheat producer. We could export lots of wheat, and we did. Pulp and paper was huge because we were fueling the American newspaper industry with our pulp and paper industries. And you know, you have to consider that we're also making a shift away from while we're shifting away from a dependence on Great Britain, we are creating conditions of dependence on the United States. Now, it wasn't intentional to be dependent, but here we have the longest undefended border. We have a huge economy south of the border that has 10 times the population of our nation, and whatever we produce, they're going to buy. So the Americans are really fueling our economy because, you know, once the Canadian market is satiated, what's going to happen to surplus stuff that's being you know, dug out of the ground or pulled out of the ocean or chopped down in the forest? Like, you have to have markets that exceed the demand of the local population, especially in Canada where our population is so small. So, all right. So the economy begins to improve. Before the war, Britain had been Canada's primary trading partner, but after the growing U.S. economy invested in Canada. So the 1920s is where we see a real shift, as I said, away from Great Britain and toward the United States. 75% of newsprint produced in Canada was exported to the U.S., and most metals mined in Canada were used in U.S.-made products like cars and radios. Okay, so our natural resources were fueling American industries. So, what happens is that's where stuff is being made, and certainly we didn't make automobiles in Canada yet. Branch plants come later, but initially we provided the raw materials that allow the American economy to grow so significantly. Most U.S. investors preferred to set up branch plants, here we go, businesses owned by U.S. companies, but which operated in Canada, like the automakers Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Okay, now the question is, of course there were plants in the United States, Ford, GM, and Chrysler automobile making plants in the U.S., but why would they be interested in doing this in Canada? Well, our dollar wasn't as strong. So in effect, you're paying people less money, so you are increasing your profits by having branch plants, right? And, you know, because you're employing Canadians, and so, you know, it made sense from an American perspective to invest in having branch plants in the States because the pay was, you know, the dollar wasn't as strong, so the profits increased. This is precisely why you get a situation, you know, here in the 21st century where so many American businesses have, over the last 20, 30 years, set up shop in Asia, particularly China. Because if you can pay somebody 50 cents an hour instead of 10 bucks an hour, you're going to be able to produce things overseas that can be sold on the American market for much cheaper, you know. And this is the big problem I've always believed with some American administrators, in the case of Trump, for example, who says, we want to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. It's been shipped overseas and buy American. And in principle, we all get that. But the thing is that if you are going to completely return all manufacturing to Americans, then you're going to have to ask Americans to pay a heck of a lot more money for consumer goods, because we want to pay American workers properly. But what that means is that consumers are going to have to pay for more expensive stuff. So it's a real conundrum for sure. The U.S. enriched Canada's economy by extracting raw materials, our primary industries, but these materials were sent to the U.S. for processing and manufacturing, secondary industries. Okay, primary industries are what we dig out of the mines. Secondary industries are the stuff that you make with the material that you pull out of the mines. Cars, boats, you know, refrigerators, whatever it may be. Canada implements prohibition during the war, but the provinces agree to regulate instead by 1921. Here starts the birth of the government liquor store outlets. Very interesting. A significant difference from the United States. The U.S. continues with prohibition until 1933, making bootlegging a profitable industry for some Canadians along the U.S. border. So it's interesting that in Canada, instead of allowing prohibition to continue well past the war like it did in the United States, we agreed that every province should have a certain degree of autonomy in regulating alcohol sales per province. And that's where the government liquor stores were born, so that the government could oversee and regulate the sale, and of course they could implement you know, a tax that would bring money to the provincial coffers as well. So Canada also became increasingly urban as many families moved to the cities for work, so there's a bit of a shift away from the countryside into the city. Cities took shape with poorer areas in the city centers near industry and more affluent residential areas in the tree-lined residential areas. So the whole landscape of the city is evolving, because, you know, cities can only grow outward. And what tended to happen is that the poor communities always kind of lived in the center of the city, and that as the city grew in population and built more on the outside, the more affluent and wealthy areas would want to be have more space, have a little bit of land, have better, cleaner air, because that's where all the manufacturing was, right smack in the middle of the city. So, you know, and we make another dramatic shift in the 1950s and 60s when we see the arrival of the mall, like the expansive mall, which become almost like a cultural hub where young people convene and where you can go one-stop shop and get your groceries and your clothing all in one place. So lots of changes yet to come. Automobiles made it feasible to live away from the polluted centers of industry in the middle of the city. So, all right. Well, one of the things you might recall, if you saw my lecture dealing with Canada in World War I, was the idea that women were given the vote. Starting in 1917, it would continue through many of the provinces, and most women got the vote by the end of World War I, although it was held back in Quebec until 1940, interestingly enough. But a lot of it was motivated by the fact that women had been so central in keeping the economy going, as the majority of young men left their jobs to fight on the front in Belgium and France, and women took up those jobs as fisher women and lumber work and all kinds of stuff to keep the economy going. And the government at the time said, you know, we can't hold back giving women the vote, particularly under these conditions. I mean, suffrage was coming for women, but I think World War I really pushed it along. So, married women, though, were still expected to stay home and raise a family, while single women were, for the most part, nurses or school teachers. In 1921, Agnes MacPhail won her seat and was the only woman in the House of Commons until 1935. So, remarkable career, incredibly bright, incredibly tenacious, and you just think of all the obstacles that someone like MacPhail had to overcome, all the stereotypes, all the sneering, but she did, and rightfully earns the respect of many, well, the majority of men within the House of Commons. So, 1929, Emily Murphy was appointed a magistrate in Alberta, which means a judge. But under the British North America Act of 1867, women were not a person, and many felt she should not hold that position. The Canadian Supreme Court agreed, but Britain declared its support for women through the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. Isn't this interesting? The Canadian Supreme Court backed the idea that women were not persons because they weren't deemed as such in the British North America Act. Ridiculous. And in this case, it was Great Britain who was still in a position to intervene on decisions like this, who said, whoa, wait a second, this is ridiculous. Of course she's a person, you know? You can't be guided by something that was, this is where an amending formula needed to come in and to change that part, right? So Britain actually intervened in saying its support for women through the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. So, a lot of changes for women in the 1920s. I mean, I have so many great stories of my grandmother, who was born in the state of Missouri, or Missouri, depending on whether you're from there or not. My grandmother always told me it was Missouri, but she was born in 1909, so she was a flapper right in the height of the late 1920s, graduating from high school in 1927, so on and so forth. So she used to talk very fondly about this period of history because she was allowed to wear what she wanted. She began to cut her hair shorter. She wore different types of clothes. If she chose to smoke, she could, or if she wanted to go for a drink in a pub, she could. There was a real sort of move towards women finding their own voice and making their own choices, right? Kind of getting away from the stifling conservatism of what was expected of them by prior generations. So, very remarkable shift of not just women, but young people in general in that period. College fads, music, dances influenced the growth of flappers, with bobbed hair, hemlines above the knees, silk stockings. Men wore straw hats, suits, bow ties, and slicked down hair. So, a lot of the sort of youth rebellion of the 1920s was fueled by the idea that young people could now get in a vehicle and drive away and go do things on their own. They could remove themselves from the ever-watchful eye of not only their parents but their greater communities. And, it became very, very common for young people to drive all over the place and explore new things and identify with themselves as being free and liberated from the constraining norms of previous generations. So there's a real sort of remarkable youth rebellion of the 20s, and really, when you look at the 20s and the youth rebellion of the 1960s, there's a lot of real interesting similarities between those two movements. In 1929, 4 million Americans spent $300 million in Canada, along with them their cultural fashion. So think about that, 4 million people traveling to Canada. I mean, our population, I'd have to look, but for some reason I recall that at the beginning of World War I, our population was 11 million. So, I mean, compared to the size of our country, that's a lot of people. And those travelers came with their fashions, with their music. I mean, jazz becomes very popular in Canada. Flappers become popular, the dress, everything. We are just beginning to really buy into American culture hook, line, and sinker by how incredibly influential the United States is on our country. All right, there we are. One of the early Model Ts. Henry Ford mastered the assembly line, and his company was able to provide a Model T Ford every 3 minutes. That's pretty good. All identical and costing under $300. In fact, Ford once said, you can have whatever color Model T you want so long as it's black. So, in 1920 there were only 1,600 kilometers of roads in Canada, but that expanded tenfold by 1930. Better roads ran south, and in 1927 British Columbia changed to driving on the right side of the road. So originally Canadians drove on the other side of the road, just like they do in Great Britain. I mean, in Great Britain, not only are vehicles driving on the other side of the road, but the steering wheel's on the other side of the car. I haven't driven in the United Kingdom. I'd be terrified to do so. But originally, that's how it was for us too. But because so many Canadians were traveling through Washington State and Idaho, because the roads are so much better, they just got accustomed to driving on the other side of the road. So the decision was made that, well, we're going to switch over too. Because that's where Canadians were going for holidays. Aviation developed as well, with many World War I pilots becoming commercial bush pilots, sending supplies and medicine to remote communities in BC and the Yukon. All those men who were in the Air Corps during World War I came back and said, well, geez, what am I going to do now? I became so good at flying, I want to keep doing that. So they got involved in transporting supplies to and from remote communities in the province. So. Also in the 1920s, the telephone became a household item, and radio beamed news and entertainment to Canadians, which was soon dominated by more powerful U.S. stations. This is, I think, where our sort of where there's a bit of a shift, because once we had access to radio and film, Hollywood, right? I think talkies came in 1927. Canadians are listening to American radio stations and watching American-made movies. So a lot of our desires for, how we looked, what we dressed, what we listened to, was being very much shaped by trends in the States. It's not that we didn't have a Canadian film industry. Well, we did, but it was pretty insignificant. And we did have great musicians in Canada too, but the real great music, the jazz, the blues, the Dixieland, all that stuff coming out of the States is what really was having a tremendous influence. So movies soon rivaled radio, and in 1927, talkies took to the screen. Canadian film could not compete with the US market, so many actors, writers, and technicians were drawn to the glitter of Hollywood. And of course, Mary Pickford would be many. It was very, very difficult. If you were in the entertainment business in Montreal and Toronto, your possibilities were very slim, particularly if you wanted to be in the film industry. You might be successful in live theater, but once again, the opportunities were limited. So if you really wanted to succeed in film or radio, most Canadians went down to the United States, went down to the United States and went to Hollywood. I mean, there's just a long list of actors that maybe even Americans aren't even aware that were Canadian, who got involved in film or music and so on and so forth, who had to go to the States in order to become famous. So 1920, the group of 7 from Ontario sought to interpret Canada's landscape using bold strokes and brilliant colors. On the west coast, Emily Carr of Victoria, British Columbia, focused on coastal forests and Aboriginal life, and would receive the Governor-General Literacy Award for a collection of short stories of her life with BC Aboriginal peoples. Here in Victoria, British Columbia, where I live, Emily Carr is a local hero. I mean, and she's a national figure as well. Whose paintings were very, very influential. She studied in San Francisco for a while, but she really was quite enchanted with the coastal forests on Vancouver Island here, and also the local First Nations people, the culture, the language, and certainly the art of that. A lot of her artwork is paintings of Aboriginal communities. And some of the critics suggest that, well, if you paint art, so if you paint something that is already a work of art, say a totem pole or a longhouse with its beautiful artwork, its beautiful West Coast art, is that then art? You know, and I mean, I'm a bit conflicted on that, but I still love her paintings. And if you're not familiar with Emily Carr, I would suggest looking her up. Canadians also developed tremendous interest in spectator sports, baseball, boxing, football, golf, and of course hockey, which was first broadcast on radio in 1923. Canadians became increasingly successful on the international stage. Vancouver's Percy Williams won 2 gold medals at the 1928 Olympics in sprinting events, and Ethel Catherwood won gold in high jump. There's Percy Williams over here. And here's a Canadian Olympic hockey team. Not sure of the year, but in addition, Canada's hockey team won gold medals by lopsided scores at nearly every Olympics. This went on for years, where kind of like American baseball teams. I mean, there's a time where they were untouchable, you know, before the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans and the Japanese and many, many others got really good and began to raise the game. And same with hockey. I mean, for the longest time, Canadian hockey teams dominated the sport, but, you know, eventually the Russians got really good, the Americans got really good, and the Czechs and the Swiss and many, many others. So, which is a good thing, because it makes for better hockey and makes for better sport when scores are not quite so lopsided. All right. So this topic, you know, really requires several lectures, because today in Canada's climate, and we're going through a period where we're really coming to terms with the dark legacy and impact that colonialism has had on First Peoples. And recently, within the last couple of years, we had a commission in Canada called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the purpose of the Truth Commission was to find out as much information that could be had from people who experienced living through the residential school phenomenon. I'm going to talk about that shortly. And even our education system is really built around sort of this great reckoning of coming to terms with the realities of our past, of Canada's past. Because as much as foreign observers look at Canada as sort of this docile, friendly place, certainly we are that. But we, like many other Western nations, have a very, very dark past with racism, bigotry, and the impacts of a colonial mentality. So a lot of stuff going on. Certainly during the 1920s, First Nations, which is a term we use in Canada for Aboriginal peoples. In the US, I believe they use the term Native Americans. It's not standardized around the world, but in Canada we refer to our Aboriginal people as First Nations. Saw little of the boom years and were still not deemed persons under the law, just like women, right, under the BNA Act. They could not vote in provincial or federal elections. In British Columbia, the vote came in 1949. We denied Indigenous peoples the right to vote. And the federal elections across Canada, First Nations could not vote until 1960. So, reserve life was poor, and those that ventured to cities for employment were met with hostility and discrimination. You know, the thing was, and there's so much backstory that is required, and down the road we'll be doing another lecture on this topic that would go into great detail. But long and short, what ends up happening in Canada is that we create a reserve system, which are lands set aside for Aboriginal peoples to live in. And they're usually set apart from major centers and major cities. And there develops over the last 150 years a system whereby Aboriginal people are sort of delegated to their reserves. Young people are forced to go to these residential schools, these church-run schools across the country. And there's understandably a great deal of discomfort and suspicion that the Aboriginal people have towards white society in general. Those First Peoples who tried to venture off the reserve and say, I'm going to go and explore this country, and I'm going to go to Vancouver or Edmonton or Calgary, when they arrived and looked for work, nobody wanted to hire them. And they were confronted with such ugly racism that they said, I don't like this. I'm going to go back to my reserve. So It's a real tragedy how our Indigenous peoples were treated. I mean, I think the narrative is very much the same across the board when you go to New Zealand and you talk about the Maori, or you go to Australia and the situation there with the Aboriginal peoples, the Aborigines as they were called. I don't even know if they use that term anymore. Or the local African population during, when South Africa was developing a colonial system there as well. So, not a particularly pretty relationship originally. Residential schools were particularly difficult for young people who were separated from their families, and although many people running the schools were well-meaning, youth were often traumatized and abused. Once again, this story is very, 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 very tragic. Essentially, for those of you that don't know what the residential schools were, is that young people were taken away from their mom and dad on these reserves, put into schools away from their parents. They might go home at Christmas or go home for the summers, but otherwise they'd be in these isolated schools where they would be taught English, they would be taught English history, they would be taught the Bible, they would be taught to leave behind all their cultural tendencies and forget their indigenous languages, and because the more they were like us, the better off they would be. That's a classic colonial mentality. We're going to make you just like us, so we're doing you a favor. We're going to strip you of everything you had because that's all irrelevant and just nonsense. So we're going to teach you, how to be a good Canadian, right? And the social consequences of that are dramatic. I mean, many, not all, we got to be clear, but many of these schools saw young children being brutally sexually and physically abused, and the Great Reckoning has happened. We now know how tragic the circumstance was for many of these Aboriginal people. So, at potlatch ceremonies, births, deaths, marriages, and other significant events were recorded in oral traditions that involved families and the entire community. It was also a way of establishing status in tribes. The potlatch was banned in British Columbia. Missionaries and the government saw it as an obstacle to assimilation, and the practice was forbidden in 1884. Well, that might be your spiritual practice, but that's irrelevant, and it's preventing you from becoming more like us. So we're going to take that away along with your language and all your cultural traditions. So, one of the things that we've learned about the legacy of the trauma caused by is that it's not just one group of children. It's been generational. There's been generations of people that, grandma went to residential school, and mom did, and the kids did, and great grandma went too, and it's just continued. There's been this cycle of brutality with which these people have been treated. And there were many First Peoples who began to think that they were inferior and think that their history and their language and culture was worthless. And it's a pretty horrible place when you begin to view your own history and culture as meaningless because that's what you've been taught and brainwashed to think. So, horrible situation. The land claims issue is another topic we'll come back and look at more thoroughly, or Aboriginal title was another major issue. BC, that is British Columbia, was unique in that only a few First Nations on Vancouver Island had negotiated land treaties. Most of BC land had not been signed away to the government, and although large tracts of land had been set aside for First Nations, the federal government had been taking land from reserves without consent of local bands known as cutoff lands. So, kind of just chipping away at their land. Well, we agreed on it, but there's nobody there right now, so maybe they won't notice. So we'll just keep chipping away at it. And many First Nations claimed the removal of this land was contrary to the Indian Act, which regulated relations between the federal government and First Nations. So then what happened was the federal government then changed the act so that First Nation consent was not required for the transfer of lands, and the Indian Act was amended to forbid the raising of land claims. I mean, if the government can constantly amend the Indian Act to accommodate their own interests, I mean, this is what's going on. It's pretty clear. So, you can see that the racism and bigotry was institutionalized, that, well, we don't value your history and your culture enough to, we're just going to change the law so that you can't defend yourself when it comes to getting access to land that you were entitled to through previous land claims. So for the BC and federal government, the issue was closed, but for BC First Nations, it was far from resolved. And certainly over the last 40 years, we've seen a huge coming to the fore of land claim issues. And, in this current climate, I think most provincial and federal governments are trying their best to be conciliatory, to be compassionate, but there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. So, well, when we talk about racism towards First Nations, we have to consider that there's unfortunately a long history. Later in another lecture we'll talk about the experience of the Chinese who came initially and predominantly to work on the building of the railroad. And we talk about Africans that came up to Canada through the Underground Railroad. Or immigrants that came from Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. That, from all directions, people are discriminating against other people, and even some minorities discriminating against others, and it's a very strange world that we lived in at one point, and changes still need to continue, but we're definitely moving in the right direction. So, during the heyday of immigration before World War I, the entry of African Americans had been discouraged. Those who came were met with blatant racism, like in Nova Scotia, where the 1918 Education Act enforced segregation, and this stayed in place until 1954. Interesting. Now, I don't know to what extent the Brown versus Board decision in the United States had, because the Brown versus Board decision was 1954, which deemed that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Now, that was in the United States, though, but maybe the trickle of that sort of trickled into Canada as well. So, in other provinces like Quebec, provincial courts segregated Montreal theatres. However, in 1924, the Edmonton City Council refused to support a ban on African Canadians in public parks and pools. And in 1919, the Brotherhood of Railway Workers accepted black porters as members, becoming the first Canadian union to abolish racial discrimination. Remarkable. 1919. Why is it that the Brotherhood of Railway Workers would be sensitive to this? I would argue that many who worked on the railway during the 1880s and beyond, who were not Chinese, understood fully the sacrifices and the brutality with which the Chinese were treated in the building of this. So there might be greater sensitivity to it, and so who knows, but it's interesting that that was the case. Eastern Europeans were restricted because they were associated with the Russian Revolution, but many wanted them for cheap labor. Asian restrictions were very severe. When in 1923 the federal government passed a law that virtually excluded Chinese immigrants until 1947. As the economy improved, immigration restrictions were relaxed as businesses sought larger populations with larger domestic markets for goods. It's always the case in history. Always we've seen this. When the economy's going well, racism and bigotry subsides. When economies struggle, you need a scapegoat, racism rears its ugly head. Just look in the United States right now, where currently, during the COVID crisis, which we are in at the moment, we're seeing an ugly resurgent lashing out, particularly at Chinese Americans right now, who are deemed as, well, the virus started in China, so it's all your fault, and you're talking to people that have lived in the United States for generations. It's ludicrous, but it's also tragic that here we are in the 21st century still dealing with the kind of bigotry that we witnessed over 100 years ago. Still, immigrants were delegated to slums. All right. So, despite racism, despite the ugly realities faced by young children in the residential schools, there was a period, as you've noted, of tremendous economic growth. But unfortunately, our dependence on the American economy dragged us down hook, line, and sinker. When that economy collapsed after the stock market crash, we went crashing down with them as well. So Canada's economy was helpless to stop the following events in the US that led to the stock market crash. In the US, the widespread use of machinery led to overproduction on farms, and prices fell for both food and industrial goods. Okay. I talk about this in great deal if you look at my lecture that deals with the United States, 1919 to 1941. If you're interested in Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1920s, I get into it there. But for our purposes, I'll give you sort of a Coles Notes version. What happened in the U.S. was that the mechanization of agriculture and industry had carried over from World War I. So, in other words, when you had all these factories making bullets and helmets during the war, they shifted to making consumer goods, radios, clocks, shoes, you name it. And in the agricultural sector, the mechanization of agriculture allowed the American farmers to produce so much. But what happens when you've produced more than the American market demands? So let's use radios as an example. You are RCA, radio company making radios. And you're pumping these things out. You got huge factories, thousands of employees, money's being made, people are getting a great service, everybody wants a radio. But what happens when everybody that wants a radio has one? Well, I guess you could ship them overseas, but you can't ship them overseas because you've put on import duties on, remember, protectionism. You have prevented foreign goods coming into the country because you want people to buy American. So now when you want to offload overproduced goods in America, other countries around the world are saying, we don't want your stuff, right? So overproduction means that, using the radio metaphor, prices go down. Nobody's buying a radio. If you're employed in the radio business, you lose your job. So having too much of something is what leads to the Depression. Unsold goods piled up and manufacturers produced less. As less was sold, people were laid off. You can see the pattern. Farmers had to, people were not buying all the corn that they were growing. People were not able to purchase all the wheat, all the milk from cows, everything. It's unbelievable. They had overproduced stuff. At the same time, people were buying stocks, called buying on margin. Real simple concept here as well. New pop company called, I'm using Coca-Cola as a metaphor. Looking for investors. Coca-Cola didn't have any money, but they had an idea. They need capital. So you go to the stock market, you buy stocks in Coca-Cola, and hundreds and thousands of people buy stocks. All of a sudden, Coca-Cola has an influx of capital so that they can, create their formula, build a factory, get people making it, and producing it, canning it, and sending it out to market. Okay? People were going to banks and they were borrowing money from the bank so they could invest in the stock market. Now, a lot of banks weren't necessarily micromanaging this, so if you were borrowing money from the bank, they might not even ask you, what do you need the money for? They give you the money, you go, you invest in the stock market. Now, what happens if you lose all that money, right? Then you can't pay the bank back. The bank forecloses on your home, you get kicked out of your house, you're on the street, and the banks end up going bankrupt because they can't retrieve money and they can't just take everyone's home, because what are you going to do with a bunch of property and nobody can afford to buy it? So, Black Thursday, 24th of October, 13 million shares were dumped and prices collapsed, and what that means is that everybody rushed to the stock market to cash their chips, because the problem is that there were no regulations to say when you could buy stocks and when you could pull them out. And the thing is, as long as your stock's going up and up and up and up, you're not going to touch it, but the trick is knowing when to pull out. And when they begin to level off for a while, and then the moment they slip down, everybody's going to go and pull their stocks out. So if Coca-Cola exists because X amount of stockholders have investment in Coca-Cola and they take their stocks out, Coca-Cola as a company no longer exists. It's a very, very crazy situation. Thousands lost their savings as the banks collapsed because the banks could retrieve the money that they loaned to people. And while largely an American phenomenon, the Canadian economy was so linked to the US that the stock market crash marked a shift from the prosperity of the 1920s to the crushing poverty of the Depression of the 1930s. So, there you have it. Lots to tell. And of course, when you get to the 30s, I mean, it's a remarkable thing. You could not have two completely different experiences between the boom of the 1920s and the bust of the 1930s. It's almost hard to believe that those two decades were right next to each other. So, that being said, thank you very much as always. And if you're interested, I would have a look at Canada in the 1930s, which will be followed by a two-part lecture on Canada during World War II. So, thank you again. We'll see you next time.